Turkish tanks crossed the border into Syria. They're part of an offensive to help the Free Syrian Army, fighters who are being backed by the Turkish government to take over Jarablus. The town on the border with Turkey has been controlled by ISIL fighters for the past 2 years. US-led coalition fighter jets are also involved in the military operation.
Bakın bu sabah 4 itibariyle
At 4 a.m. this morning, our army and security forces started operations in the north of Syria against terror groups which constantly threaten our security, like ISIL and the YPG.
Free Syrian army fighters are also on the move to capture Jarablus. The FSA, backed by Turkey and the US, has been largely undermined by conservative groups such as the Army of Conquest, which controls Idlib and parts of Aleppo province.
We are fighters originally. We were here to liberate Jarablus from ISIL and also to defeat the gangs of the YPG who wants to establish a separatist entity.
Jarablus and Al-Bab are the last remaining towns under ISIL control in northern Syria. But ISIL isn't the only reason for the increased Turkish involvement in Syria. Kurdish fighters from the YPG are also in action. They have recently consolidated their gains in Hasaka and taken over the city of Manbij. Jarablus is their next destination. The Turkish government accuses the YPG of being an extension of the PKK. Turkey has waged war against the separatist group for more than 20 years. The YPG has been a key ally of the US in the fight against ISIL in Syria. The Turkish leadership wants the US to sever ties with the Kurdish faction. The YPG isn't the only sticking point between Turkey and the US. Vice President Joe Biden is in Ankara as the Turkish government presses the US for the extradition of Fethullah Gulen. The leader of the Gulen movement, who lives in exile in the US, denies Turkish accusations of planning last month's failed coup. The US government says it's waiting for concrete evidence before making a decision.
We have no interest whatsoever in protecting anyone who has done harm to an ally. None. But we need to meet the legal standard requirement under our law.
The US and Turkey are key players in the Syrian conflict. Both have maintained close cooperation since the start of the civil war. Cooperation that may be undermined if the two allies fail to resolve their differences. Hashim Mahbar, Al Jazeera, Gaziantep.
havan atıldı, uyar rejiyi abi. Acil gelsinler abi. Evet, aslında ben çekileyim de görüntüyü daha rahat görmek mümkün olsun. Zira az önce bir...
The ancient city of Timbuktu was occupied by rebel fighters 4 years ago. What followed shocked many. Ansar Deen, which is linked to Al-Qaeda, destroyed 14 ancient mausoleums and part of a mosque. Hundreds of years of history smashed into pieces because it offended the invaders' strict interpretation of Islamic law. Many sites were on UNESCO's World Heritage List. At the International Criminal Court, Ahmed al-Faqi al-Mahdi is expected to plead guilty to directing the destruction. He's the first person to be tried in The Hague only for war crimes committed against buildings and culture. At a pre-trial hearing last September, Mahdi listened to the charges and identified himself.
I am from the Tuareg tribe of Al-Sar. I was born about 40 years ago in Aguni. I'm a graduate of the Teachers Institute in Timbuktu, and I was a civil servant in education in the Mali government beginning in 2011.
Ansar Deen fighters fled Timbuktu in 2013 when French and Malian troops advanced on the city. Conflict has continued in northern Mali, where the UN mission is considered the most dangerous in the world. Timbuktu, once an important centre of Islamic learning, suffered badly during the 10-month occupation. Girls were prevented from attending school and music was banned. Some activists say the ICC should have filed more charges against Mahdi, including rape and sexual slavery, and gone after more senior figures.
What is at stake here is not just walls and stones.
The ICC's chief prosecutor has likened the Timbuktu case to last year's destruction by ISIL of historic ruins in the Syrian city of Palmyra. ISIL fighters also smashed artifacts in Mosul Museum in Iraq. If the case against Mahdi is successful, it will send a clear message to the wreckers of some of the world's most important cultural sites. Nadeem Barber, Al Jazeera.
This is what a blast feels like for Syrian children. The mother shouts that they haven't been hit. And this is what exploding munitions look like from many windows in Aleppo. Most rebel-held areas are being hit hard inside the city and in the nearby countryside. According to the Syrian Observatory, more than 460 civilians have been killed since the start of August, including more than 100 children. Activists say airstrikes by Syrian and Russian jets have continued.
In this attack, more than 15 civilians were killed and 30 wounded.
Volunteer rescuers have also been responding to strikes in the Damascus suburb of Douma and in Idlib. In addition to aerial strikes, artillery attacks have also been targeting areas under rebel control, and more civilians have been killed. Syrian state media is reporting heated battles in southern Aleppo. The rebel alliance Fatah al-Sham has taken more areas, including an armament college, in the last few days. Fighters say they've pushed back Syrian troops, backed by Iranian and Hezbollah fighters. Further north, near the Turkish border, there have been more clashes between regime forces and Kurd fighters. Backed by US air power, Kurdish forces say they're making progress and have captured more districts near the government-controlled city centre. Government planes have been bombing Kurdish-held areas since Thursday. The Syrian army has accused Kurdish forces of trying to take over the area. Now state media says Assad forces have reached an agreement with the Kurds to evacuate the wounded and begin dialogue. Thousands of people have fled Hasaka, seeking safety and medical help. That's added to the nearly 7 million Syrians already forced out of their homes. And as more bombs hit residential areas, more Syrians continue to die, while many of those lucky to survive are left with nowhere to live. Osama bin Javed, Al Jazeera.
All right, let's get the very latest now by talking to our correspondent Hashim Mahubara. He's in Gaziantep on the Turkish-Syria border. And Hashim, can you explain to us why the city of Hasaka is being so bitterly contested between Kurdish forces and Syrian government troops?
Martin, since the uprising in Syria started in 2011, the Kurdish factions were quick to control half of the city of Hasaka, and the army maintained a presence, particularly government buildings, garrisons and military bases. And there was some sort of tacit agreement between the Syrian government and the Kurdish factions to avoid confrontation, prompting the other Syrian rebel factions to accuse the Kurdish fighters of colluding with the Syrian regime. Now things are changing on the ground, and the Kurdish factions, particularly the YPG, which is the armed military branch of the Kurdish factions, is now on the offensive, saying that it is determined this time to drive Assad fighters, soldiers out of Hasaka and control it. As we speak, Martin, Kurdish fighters control a huge area in northern Syria that stretches from Hasaka all the way to Afrin on the outskirts of Aleppo. This is quite significant for them because this is part of their self-autonomous region, which they call Rojava, and they seem to be pretty much determined this time to continue the fight until all that area is uncontested and under their own control.
And this is likely then, Hashim, isn't it, to set alarm bells ringing in the region, because it's not just the Syrian government who are reluctant to allow more power, more self-determination for the Kurds in northeastern Syria.
Absolutely. This is a development that is closely monitored by the Turkish government, which has in the past voiced concerns about the territorial gains made by the SDF, which is the umbrella organization of the different Kurdish factions fighting in northern Syria. The Turkish government accuses most of these factions, particularly the YPG, of being an extension of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, which Turkey considers a terrorist organization. And the Turkish government said in the past that it is definitely not going to tolerate a Syrian Kurdish presence on the border with Turkey. It's quite also delicate for the Americans because over the past 2 years in particular, the Americans have been teaming up with the SDF in their push to drive ISIL out of the areas they control in northern Syria. And with the fighting now raging between government troops and the Kurdish factions, this is going to put the Americans in a very delicate situation. They made it quite clear in the past that the Kurdish factions are their major allies in Syria. And just a few days ago, when the Syrian government was pounding Kurdish areas in Hasaka, the Americans had to scramble some of the Syrian aircrafts for fear that their own special operations ground forces might be targeted in those airstrikes. So the general sentiment as we speak in Syria is that people are concerned Syria may never be the same again. It might just further fall apart because each faction is determined this time to have its own land.
Hashim Al-Bara live in Gaziantep. Thank you.
The main Kurdish armed faction, the